Great, thank you. Thank you to everyone for attending. It's been a fantastic day today. A lot to think about, a lot to take forward. My name is Claire Carton. I'm from Griffin Legal in Canberra and I'm on the CLAANZ board. I'm very disappointed not to be there. I decided not to attend in present because I knew COVID would get me. And sure enough, it's gotten two of my children. So I made the right decision. I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land across the nation that we are each meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We are fortunate enough today to have an esteemed panel and I thank them each for their time and effort. Miles McGregor-Lowndes is remote like myself and I understand Natalie and Matthew are present in person. I will read their bios out for you, starting with Dr. Matthew Turnover. He is the chairman of Newman Turner Lawyers, where he practices principally in the areas of charity law and governance. He was one of 4 panellists appointed by the Australian Parliament to review the legislation establishing the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, reporting in 2018. He is an honorary senior fellow at Melbourne Law School, a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and an international advisory board member of Cambridge Government Labs, Hughes Hall, Cambridge. He's also a sessional crime and corruption commissioner in Queensland. Moving on to our second presenter for this session, it's Dr. Natalie Silver, who is a senior lecturer at the Australian Sydney Law School. Her research interests include not-for-profit law and regulation. Natalie holds a PhD from the Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Not-for-Profit Studies at QUT and a Masters of Laws from Harvard Law School. She previously worked as an attorney in the New York office of Kirkland and Ellis and as a philanthropic advisor at JP Morgan Private Bank and Jewish Funders Network in New York. And finally, to Emeritus Professor at QUT, Miles McGregor-Lowndes. He's the former director of the Australian Centre of Philanthropy and Non-Profit Studies. He was a founding member of the ATO Charities Consultative Committee and the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission Advisory Board. So an impressive panel that we have here today. And they're going to be discussing Division 50 of the Income Tax Assessment Act. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes and we'll, like the other sessions, we'll reserve questions from the end. Please pop questions in the Q&A. Our presenters are working off the one PowerPoint and they will indicate when they would like the slides changed. I'd like to invite Matthew to provide the introduction and context.
Thank you very much and thank you for the welcome. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to those elders past, present and emerging. I have the enormous privilege of contextualising the discussion that's about to take place. I'm going to do it in 2 parts. One is a very brief history of how we get to the discussion in relation to Division 50 that's for us this afternoon. And second, just a very brief introduction of a little bit of tax theory for those that are bored witless and really want something stimulating. So I'm Natalie, did that the budget of 20, just to give it, just go back the slide. I've got the introduction, then Natalie's going to take you through Division 50, and then Miles is going to make some observations. That's how we've broken it up between us. By way of history, the budget of 2021/2022, there was 1,862,000, about 1.9 million, set aside for to the ATO to build an online system to enhance the transparency of income tax exemptions claimed by exempt non-profits. Now that has a history that traces back to the panel of which I was a reviewer. We recommended that these entities with a turnover of 5 million or more be transferred to the ACNC for supervision. The government did not accept that recommendation. In total, there's about 130 or 140,000 entities in this group. Many of them are probably very micro. We thought that about 580 was a good number to start migrating across to the ACNC, particularly given the ACNC had Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits in its title. We thought that it should start regulating non-profits as well. And we thought that sort of a number would pick up everything above 5 million. And if there was high risk, chances were it was in an entity above 5 million. So that was the basis for our recommendation. The government responded saying they didn't accept that recommendation and that they were going to follow things through with the ATO. And this budget announcement is in essence an expression of that. So what you have then is the ATO has always supervised these entities. Now it's building or developing or doing something with a register, which I understand is not going to be open to the public. It's only going to be so that the ATO itself has transparency on these entities. So those people that thought that when they read the announcements that there was going to be higher levels of accountability and transparency to the public, as I understand it, that probably won't be the case. In relation to tax theory, I might sorry, before I move off that slide, I probably should just say, sorry, Natalie, the other way. The effect of it will be that there is presently no reporting, although these entities are expected to be self-assessing. That is, on an annual basis, as a matter of law, they really should be turning their minds to whether or not in that particular tax year they are entitled to ongoing assessment and ongoing exemption. But the reality is, probably that in many of them, they don't really do that exercise on an annual basis. And it's going to be a question of fact to be determined over time as to whether or not they are in fact have been doing that. But what's now going to happen is they're going to have to turn their mind to that. And starting from the 1 July 24 year, they will need to lodge their first return. It'll be an online self-review form. It is not a tax return. That's fairly important. It is not the Australian equivalent of the American Form 990 for those that know what I'm talking about. It's simply a statement that they have self-assessed in accordance with the format that's going to be released. The subject is now up really for discussion. Tax has begun taking the issues out to talk with the sector about these things. Turning to theory, I think I've done that. The last issue probably I didn't mention, that is equity issues and tax policy. It just seems to me that it's fundamentally unfair that you've got these massive non-profits which are sometimes acting for member benefits. So they're not principally altruistic like charities, and they've got no real public accountability and no real private accountability either in terms of beyond the immediate membership, if that. You've got these tiny charities out there having to fill in all the compliance requirements that come with being an ACNC registered entity. So I just want to flag equity. I'll come back to that in a second, but at the time we did the review, I thought, let's at least bring the 5 million across, the ones about 5 million or above across. Now let's go to the next slide, Natalie, thanks. The first point that I want to remind us from, and it's a very, very high level point, is that tax legislation is fundamentally about distributive justice. It is the primary method by which we give expression to the need to distribute resources differently from the way they might fall out in the usual course of things. The Tax Act then splits into two arms, the simpler and the more complex. The simpler arm is almost always forgotten and almost never mentioned, and that is that it's to enable and encourage voluntary redistributions. So what we're asking in Divisions 50 and Divisions 30 essentially is that people who want to remove all the transaction costs essentially of transferring money from wealthy to poor, to put in really simple language, we simply facilitate that through the Tax Act. And if you think about it, that's the primary easy way to reallocate and redistribute in a just fashion by getting your draftings of Divisions 30 and 50 correct. Because then the government is providing the appropriate infrastructure for easy transfers of assets from, in very, very colloquial terms, the rich to the poor. That tends to be forgotten, and the focus tends to be on the more difficult and the more complex process, and that is the non-voluntary, the compulsory redistribution of wealth through tax. But let's always remember that the Tax Act has two functions, not one, and that's the primary function of Divisions 30 and 50, of which 50 is our focus. The next thing to say is, and I can't spend very long on this because I'm just making introductory comments, but we have tax design principles built into the way we approach tax in Australia, and they were best articulated and are still at least nodded to, arising out of the Henry Review. And they're these 5 principles: efficiency, equity, complexity, sustainability, and consistency with policy. Now, I don't wish to go through each of those in detail because I'll hand over to Natalie in just a second. But what we're really saying is, you can see the first one. If we can get people to voluntarily transfer in accordance with a really well-drafted set of exemption and deductibility provisions, you reduce transaction costs enormously. If we can treat all entities that are roughly similarly, then you've got equity. And so on, you want to get rid of complexity, you want to make sure it's sustainable. I'm very worried that if you start regulating all these tiny little entities, it's just a waste of resources that's not sustainable in a budget deficit environment. But they're all issues that need to be thought about. That's one of the reasons we said cap it at 580 to start with. With those introductory comments, I hand over to Natalie.
Thanks, Matthew. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So Matthew provided a bit of an introduction and some context on this ATO assessment project for income tax exempt entities. And some of the issues that are associated with that project. So I would like to talk about an opportunity, I think, that the project presents, and that is the opportunity for legislative reform, and specifically reform of Division 50 of the Income Tax Assessment Act of 1997, which is, as we've already said, the tax law that provides tax exemption for not-for-profits. So for those of you who are not familiar with the details of Division 50, and I know there are a number of you here who are quite familiar with it, but there are 5 broad categories of eligibility that an entity must fall into. And then within Division 50, there are 30 classes of entities that are eligible for tax exempt status. So this obviously includes registered charities, and they are then endorsed by the ATO for income tax exemption, but it also includes other not-for-profit entities, and those are the ones that we're speaking about here in terms of this self-assessment project, and they are eligible, they self-assess under various classes of Division 50. So for these entities to be eligible for income tax exemption, they also have to satisfy, depending on the entity, they have to satisfy these conditions that I have up on the slide. So there are 4 conditions in Division 50. The first is the not-for-profit condition, and that is that the entity is not carried on for the profit or gain of its individual members. Most of you would be familiar with that. Then there's the in Australia condition, that the entity have a physical presence in Australia, and to that extent it incurs its expenditure and pursues its objectives principally in Australia. And in the case of Word Investments, the High Court took quite a broad view, actually, of the in Australia condition. Then we have 2 conditions that are known as the governance conditions, and that is that the entity must comply with all the substantive requirements of its governing rules, and the entity must also apply its income and assets solely for the purpose for which the entity was established. So when you've got language like solely, you know that issues are going to arise, and a lot of issues have arisen in that area. So that's a very, very brief overview of Division 50. And for those of you who attended either online or in person, the John Emerson oration last year that was presented by Professor Anne O'Connell from Melbourne Law School, she talked about the not-for-profit tax regime in Australia as being a dog's breakfast and not being fit for purpose. And really, Division 50 does exemplify that. And this is largely a result, the fact that the not-for-profit tax regime is not fit for purpose is largely a result on the way based on the way it's developed over time, decades of ad hoc political decision making. So that has been a problem, and it results in what I've said here, the last point on the slide. It's the Division 50 itself, part of this dog's breakfast, it's just no longer able to expound the law with clarity in a way, particularly for people that sit on particularly voluntary non-profit boards and some of the staff. It makes it very hard for them to understand. So let's talk about, next slide, why is Division 50 no longer fit for purpose? And I've put a few points up here, but I do need to acknowledge that Miles McGregor-Lowndes, our next speaker, has actually written a primer on the reform of tax-exempt non-profit entities. So if you want to go into more detail on any of this, you can look to Miles's primer to get much more information. It's a very comprehensive report, and not only is Miles good at writing reports, he's very good at finding cartoons that fit the slides very well. So thanks, Miles, for that. And I think it sort of hones that point in of the dog's breakfast to this particular comic. So why is Division 50 such a dog's breakfast in and of itself? Why is it no longer fit for purpose? Well, despite, as I said, there being 30 classes of entities in Division 50 that are eligible for tax-exempt status, there appears to be no clear principle actually underlying eligibility. In 2013, the Not-for-Profit Sector Tax Concession Working Group suggested that the principle of public benefit, as understood at common law, would be the most useful sort of general guide for determining eligibility of tax-exempt status. That obviously already exists for registered charities that have been endorsed for income tax exemption. And in terms of the tax design principles, those principles that Matthew mentioned before, it would obviously help to simplify the tax system for not-for-profits. Secondly, the tax concessions combined with the introduction of a statutory definition of charity has actually resulted in an overlap of the exempt classes of charity definitions. So if you think about, for example, a scientific institution or a public educational institution, they're exempt classes in Division 50, but they obviously also fall within a sort of traditional definition of charity as well. So again, from a tax design perspective, it's created unnecessary complexity for not-for-profits, and it makes implementation less efficient. There are a number of examples of inconsistent treatment of different types of entities. Matthew touched on that point in his talk, so I won't go into too much detail. But the next point, there's also no common statutory definition of not-for-profit in the tax legislation and the Charities Act. In fact, there are multiple definitions in the tax legislation, and then there are no definitions in the Charities Act and the ACNC legislation. So that clearly creates an issue as well. It impacts on that first condition that I mentioned, the not-for-profit condition in Division 50, because the boundary of when members are actually receiving benefits that infringe the not-for-profit condition becomes blurred. Finally, I've mentioned the regulatory overlap of the governance conditions. So as I said, the governance conditions are particularly problematic for charities, which are also subject to comparable rules in the ACNC Act. So proposed reforms, if there is one takeaway from my presentation today, it is that the proposed self-assessment for income tax exempt entities should not be implemented until the tax legislation is reformed so that it has a clear policy direction and some sort of internal logic that is coherent and that meets the benchmarks of an appropriate tax system. Now, none of the reforms that I've listed on the slide here are new or novel in any way. They've actually all been proposed for years now, but not implemented. Most recently, probably in some of those submissions to the ACNC review in 2018. So they have been years in the making. but I'll just briefly mention them there. So firstly, removing the overlap of the Division 50 exempt classes with the charity definitions, I said before. Secondly, the existing category of entities that are in Division 50 need to be reviewed and consolidated, and with a view, again, to looking at only those who have some sort of purpose that is significant to the public benefit being able to access that provision. Thirdly, adopting a statutory definition of not-for-profit in the Charities Act and in the tax legislation as well. I think that could be very helpful, and in fact that would probably require again some sort of statutory intervention to clarify again what is the boundary between non-profit and for-profit, and what is the boundary between member benefit and societal benefit. Then removing the regulatory overlap and the associated red tape of the governance conditions. As I said, the governing rules condition actually already applies to charities under the Charities Act. So that could just be repealed, which has been suggested in the past, and also the sole purpose condition could at least be amended, because that use of the word solely, again, is particularly problematic. So finally, the final reform that I have here is extending the scope of the ACNC regulations to other not-for-profit entities, particularly those with significant revenue. And that's what Matthew mentioned before, that 5 million entities with 5 million or more potentially having them register with the ACNC could be important. And I know that Miles also has more to say on this particular point. So I'm actually going to hand it over to you now, Miles, to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Good afternoon, everybody. I endorse the recognition of the first inhabitants given today. I want to acknowledge not only Matthew and Natalie's presentation today, but the worthy contribution they are making to the sector and the profession more widely. I believe this marks their complete recovery from doctoral supervision traumas. I've published a paper that is available for download after being asked by a couple of peak non-profit people about what the heck was going on with this out of the blue budget announcement. I'm continually surprised, despite the significant efforts of the ATO to flag the proposals, to meet CEOs, CFOs and board members of peaks, sports, community groups, large unions, employer associations, hospitals and medical insurance organisations that are all caught up in Division 50, that they don't have an inkling about what this proposal is or what it's about. So firstly, my observations. Modelling regulatory behaviour is incredibly important for the modern regulator to get the KPIs ticked with the biggest bang for their ever-shrinking buck and with the least cost and disruption to their targets. As we've heard, Division 50 needs some significant reform, and the government ought to put its own house in order before requiring non-profits to do the same. This process would in itself be a significant nudge to better regulation, better compliance, and less unintended consequences. Second, why? No reasons have been offered by government or the Treasury as to why the ATO is the more appropriate agency to undertake this transparency measure rather than the ACNC with a 5 million threshold, as the considered recommendation was made. Where is the most effective and efficient place for this regulation? It's got to be asked. The new government needs to respond and step in if necessary. Third, proportionality. I'm concerned about the proportionality of the measure. Are the costs of the organisation proportionate to their capacity and the identified risk to the revenue? And are they benefits worth the cost to the regulator? Now, there are some good points to the proposal. Firstly, it's digital and it's a self-assessment filing, not a tax return. And I think that's excellent. But is it proportionate? It's basically having an ABN that qualifies you. And note that having an ABN catches too many small organisations who require it not because of their size or substance, but because it's a requirement of grant funding, various licenses, for example, a business name registration. For example, in Victoria, 90% of incorporated associations have less than 250,000 in annual turnover. That's a lot of organisations. And in Queensland, 4 out of 5 have less than 100,000 in income. So this potentially can catch a lot of very small organisations. In other OECD jurisdictions, they have proportionate thresholds. In USA, they have what's called, for tax purposes, an e-postcard. If you're under 50,000 gross revenue, you just put 8 pieces of information. Used to be on a paper postcard, but now it's digital. But it's still it's now called an e-postcard. And then if you didn't respond in 3 years, you then got automatic revocation. I think this is a more light touch way of the revenue authorities keeping track of who's who in the zoo. Further, in terms of proportionality, there are about 8,000 taxable non-profit entities with a taxable income threshold of greater than $416. Yes, $416 is the threshold. It was first set in the 1960s and has never changed. Talk about bracket creep. Surely if the government's going to introduce this, it should raise the threshold for non-profits as recommended by the industry review just before the change of government. The next slide, please, is the graphic here. I couldn't help but put it in. It's one of the greatest ACNC nudges of all time, which I think, in my view, was more effective than the political shoves of recent time. But fourthly, rulings. It's regulatory practice 101 that you get your rulings in tip-top shape before you pack audit. It avoids the situation that the ACNC now finds itself in, trying to do a CIS or several CISs review halfway through an audit program. Nudges that a rulings consultation brings gets a lot of the work done for you. That's smart regulation. The ATO, to their credit, has flagged that the sports ruling will be out soon after a good consultation. In my view, however, there's scope for other rulings on things such as hospital in the home, a revised one on community services practices, which it's been a while since we've looked at that, and then particularly direct and indirect member benefits, which flows into the definition of not-for-profit. So I think we should have looked at the rulings. Fifth, data disclosure. These self-assessment forms are going to produce an awful lot of data. And as researchers, we know next to nothing about the demographics of Division 50 organisations. The aggregated data would be very useful if made public and not kept just in the ATO. If it was collected in usable, classifiable, ABS, ICNPO form, it would be very useful to researchers and other parts of government, state and federal. Again, here's a nudge for the ATO to consider. If the information provided in these returns is useful to the useful to the sector, then they perceive it as not merely falling into a black hole, but have a wider useful purpose, and this encourages better and more timely returns. The Productivity Commission report on charities recommended a whole of government information development plan for such statistics to be developed. Now, finally, funding. If this proposal does go ahead, my prediction is that community legal centres are going to be overrun with people wanting assistance, let alone lawyers and accountants. So there should be increased one-off funding for it and an education program, not only run by the ATO, but by others. The ATO should be funded to examine properly all the self-assessment returns. It would just be so discouraging if they decided to only have a look at those with over 5 million revenue, which is probably logical. They should be properly funded to do a proper job with the reviews. They ought to consider a nudging that's used in the US a bit. State regulators for non-profits often leverage off the IRS tax form for non-profits, the 990, and put another page on the 990, which is shared with the state bodies, and so they get all the information from the 990 and then just have a look at the later page which occurs to them. They used to, in years gone by, when the forms were paper, to be paid by the IRS to collect them, and they got paid on the percentage that they actually got collected in a timely fashion. What they used to do to boost collection rates was by return post to the organisations pretty quickly after all the returns were put in, was to send them back the summary, the aggregated summary of what an organisation in the locality of their sort, what the financial metrics were, which was a great benchmarking for non-profits. This was a virtuous information cycle which made them get their returns in on time and in better order. Finally, the funding, the ATO really should get funding to fund some special test case litigation in this area to allow appropriate judicial clarification of contested interpretations of Division 50 provisions. So there's a funding list despite if a government's going to bring this in, it's a funding list despite the budgetary constraints we heard of this morning. Thank you for your attention. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Miles, and thank you, Matthew and Natalie. And I guess I'll echo Miles's comment of thanking all three of you for your contribution to much needed reform in this area. Now, handling questions remotely, what is the best way from the floor?
I'll help with questions in the room. Are there any online questions before we check in the room? No, Jessie's shaking her head. So if anyone would like to ask a question, just put your hand up. And whilst they're thinking of a question, I might take this opportunity to ask a question myself, and it might be a bit provocative, so I hope that's okay. But there were many complaints about the dog's breakfast of Division 50, and so I guess what I'd like your thoughts on is why not just double down on not-for-profit for a lawful purpose, and you've got charitable and non-charitable not-for-profits for a lawful purpose, and get rid of much of the rest of the baggage on the basis that the reason we give, or the best case I've seen for a tax exemption for not-for-profits, is they can't go out and raise capital from shareholders because they're not-for-profit. And so there's a logical reason for extending an income tax exemption to all of those not-for-profits. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that. You might tell me, well, that will mean social clubs are included, but from what the Minister said earlier, that might be seen as quite a good thing if we're trying to build social capital. I'll stop talking and hand over to the two of you and to Miles.
You want me to start it off? It's certainly possible, and it makes a lot of sense to draw a line between charity and not-for-profit, not only for the reasons that you've just said, but conceptually, charity starts from a paradigm where you identify the entity with respect to its purpose. And that's drawn out of equity historically as a jurisprudential body of space. When you go to non-profit, that effectively, in real terms, is drawn out of the 1970s developments of American corporate law jurisprudence. They're two completely different bodies of law, and frequently we are trying to match them together and making a real mess of it. And with the greatest of respect to the drafters of the Charities Act, they made a meal of that aspect too. When you come to Division 50, I'm not sure that I would just go into those two categories, because I think we do need to divide the non-profits that are more altruistic from the ones that are less altruistic. I think we need to divide the clubs from the ones that are surf life-saving clubs, so to speak, the ones that exist for public benefit and the ones that don't. Whether that's a continuum or whether that's classes, I'm not sure. And I'd probably be open to pushing a bit further on that if the conversation wants to go there. But that's probably enough of an introduction in response to your initial queries. So they're my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, again, there are so many overlapping classes that your radical proposal would simplify things, like take it to the other extreme maybe. But is there perhaps a middle ground where there are a lot less than these 30 overlapping classes and something that has more internal logic, I think. Miles?
Yeah, no, I've got nothing more to add.
So I'll just, we've got a, Bridget, I think you've got a question.
I think nobody else. That brings me to what was raised by you, sir. Yes. Thank you. Earlier today with the Minister about sport. So you're talking about not-for-profits that are more for public benefit and those that are not. So why don't we take something like sports and my son's footy club and make it charitable?
I'm happy to take that as well if you'd like me to. Because I had nothing to do with my life, I sat down one day, and it was really 1 month, and I read all the sport cases. And instead of looking at them from charity law perspective, I looked at them from a tax perspective, and have a guess what? They all make perfect sense. If the decision is made in a jurisdiction where there's deductibility, they're denied charity status. If they're in a context where they're not, where they don't get deductibility, they're not denied charity status as a general proposition. There are exceptions to the rule, but it just made sense of AYSA and all of the other sporting cases in Australia too. I think we need to think carefully about sport and bringing it into, like I would bring it into the charity category. That's where I sit generally. But there is a difference between a private polo club and the local sailing club and the local rugby club and so on. And I think we've got to give some thought. And again, it'll come back to where we draw those lines. So there's a couple of comments on sport that might be helpful for this room. They can be pushed a lot harder too, but that's probably enough to kick it off.
That's pretty comprehensive, especially as you've read all the cases.
Ian.
Although, Miles, you might have something to also say about the amateur sports, right?
Yeah. And in my paper, I say it's well overdue for amateur sport to go into the charity status. Really, it is. The UK have had only good experiences with it, and I think the role that sport plays in our society and the importance that amateur sport is now having on health and well-being and community connection and all those other things that the Minister spoke about. Clearly, they deserve and should be in the charity status. Where I draw the line is what Professor Ann Connell remarked at in the Emerson lecture last year, and that is with that sport which has become clearly a media entertainment event, and there has to be a line drawn between the two. But I'm sure our drafters are well and truly up to that. So, yep, in the revamp, I make the case that amateur sport should go into the Charities Act.
I would just add a comment in relation to that. Really big sport in this country, I think, needs to be looked at carefully anyway. I just say that. I think there was another thought that I had that might be useful on that as well, but because I remember benefit, all of those sorts of things I think are very live, and I think it's very different from a little sporting club which teaches kids to run or bat or swim or whatever it is they're doing. But we're capable of finding our way through that. There's enough clever people in this room that could do that.
Let's run the world.
Any other questions that people have? I think you've convinced everyone.
That's good.
Claire, I'll hand back over to you because I think we've had all our questions from the room.
I'll just make a final comment on the sport. I've done a lot of work over the years for very well-funded sports, so I'm a lot more cautious about charity status for sports. Seeing just the volume of money that comes into sports that aren't just for entertainment, and that some very well-funded industries in Australia will jump at the chance to make donations, I suspect, for other reasons. Anyway, I thank the three speakers again, and then I believe, Natalie, we finished early, but I believe we're chair for the next session. Is that correct?
I'm chairing the next session. I'm going to move over to that chair.
Yeah.